how do you develop empathy?
So I think paying attention, really, it starts with you. I mean, in my book, I have a chapter which is, empathy, it's about you. Or it starts with you, but it's all about them. So without any self-awareness, you can't have any real understanding of other people because there's no context. So I really think that paying attention sounds simple. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. But for example, let's just say thinking about how you work best and when you find your flow, or when you get triggered. There's some of that stuff which is also to do with DBT, the dialectical behavioral therapy, which is like, is this emotion I'm feeling right now proportionate to what actually happened? And if it's not, I should be paying attention to this, and maybe if this is not going to be productive in this conversation, I may have been triggered by something. I should probably try and work out what that is, note it down, what was said, and just paying attention to all these different things. How am I at my best? When am I at my worst? I get really stressed. I travel a lot, but I get really stressed. And I even tell my kids, like, that I get really stressed when I'm, in those last few hours and trying to pack up. So please be nice to me. Or just like recognize I haven't yet managed to bring those stress levels down and that tension that I feel and the difference in how I react. But at least I know that I do it. So I've got to like deconstruct that a little bit better. And I typically, yes, I should plan and I should, pack way in advance, but that doesn't happen yet.
This episode is sponsored by Classical Conversations. Since 1997, Classical Conversations has been equipping families like yours with the resources to homeschool with confidence, following a classical curriculum rooted in a Christ-centered worldview alongside other families in a local community. Homeschooling is doable with Classical Conversations. Check out classicalconversations.com/Gibbons for more information. Again, that's classicalconversations.com/Gibbons, Gibbens. So, all right, EQ Gangster audience, what is up? I'm super stoked to introduce to you all our guest today. I call her Super Sophie. So she she has got an amazing background, and I'm super excited to hear her insights and wisdom on a very, very important aspect of emotional intelligence, which is empathy. I think if we had more empathetic leadership in the world would be very different right now. And as she gets her message out, she's got an awesome book that I want her to talk about as well on empathy that can give some insights and tips on how we can become more empathetic human beings, more empathetic leaders. Let me just read her background. Sophie is a work futurist, keynote speaker, and workforce innovation specialist at Flexcell Network. Sophie's advisory services and workshops help leaders adapt to attract, engage, and retain a multi-generational distributed workforce. Sophie's new book is Empathy Works: The Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work. Sophie hosts popular podcast Transforming Work with Sophie Wade. Over 500,000 people have taken her LinkedIn courses, and she got her BA at Oxford and an MBA at INSEAD. So thank you so much, Super Sophie. It's so great to have you.
Well, I am thrilled to be here, Noble, and I'm still loving your name. I don't have a suitable adjective to go with Super Sophie, but I'm going to think of one by the end.
Ninja Noble is one I get.
Ninja Noble. Well, the thing is, I have two dogs, and one of them is called Ninja, so I don't want to do that. But I love the idea of Ninja. Sounds good.
That's awesome. So, can you share? How did you share your emotional journey, the arc of your emotional journey? How did you become empathetic? Why is it such a big deal?
It's a big deal. I think we all we all have our journeys to have more self-awareness and more understanding, uh, first with ourselves, about ourselves, and then with others. And as we were just talking about right in the preamble, it is often to do with difficult situations we've been in that is core self-reflection. I've had a lot of self-reflection about sort of my childhood, and but didn't really realize some of the things that I went through. I mean, I have that my family is a number of strong characters, and I think when we sort of evolve out of that, and then the patterns that we display in our working lives or with our friendships, but particularly in our working lives, do play out some of the balance or imbalance of some of those relationships that we learned, and the patterns of behavior that we learned when we were a kid. And you have certain let's just say with narcissistic people, it's all about them. The needs are all like, it's all about my needs. And then you have the other side of it, which is sort of somehow how I ended up, which is having no needs. It was all about serving others. And neither of these is helpful. It's a question of a balance of needs, of having that. So let's just say with empaths, we can like, well, what do I do if I give up everything and to the other person? No, it needs to be a balance. So that was some of the starting piece of it for me. The other huge piece was I left England, where I grew up, right after university, and I had studied Chinese, sort of poetry, history, philosophy, culture, and I wanted to go and experience it. And I'd already spent a bit of time out there, and so I lived and worked in Hong Kong for 5 years, and since then I've also worked in Germany for 2.5 years, and Italy for several months. In France, I was at a business school, and when you and now in the States for almost 20 years. So when you're living and working in a different country, you really need to get inside other people's heads and try and understand what's going on and try and understand the culture, because otherwise you could visit and still be exactly who you are and not sort of pay attention to what the cultural norms are, but how people think about the world and life and all the rest of it. But if you're going to live there, you really need to do that. So that was a hugely impactful set of experiences for me that really brought me on this journey. And also in that was also in the working environment, like how people's different attitudes to work, people's involvement in work and engagement with work, and whether it was all of their life, and whether people, for example, in this country, people assume you're going to work all weekend, or suddenly you can ditch a dinner and just say I'm really sorry I have to work late. So it's like, oh, you poor thing. If you do that in Europe, I had to be reminded recently, they will think that that's very rude. Like that is not a reasonable excuse to miss a dinner party because you have a lot of work. So these cultural norms help us understand that people think about these things very differently. And so that was a big part of my journey. In terms of emotional journey, that's interesting because as you go through, in different places, people have different reactions. The whole English thing is, don't show your emotions on your face. And that really didn't work so much for me because as you can see, Noble, I, wear my emotions on my face. So that was really not going to work very well. But then, of course, in Hong Kong with the Chinese culture, it's also, there's actually a good correlation with saving face. And so there's the idea of what you're showing and helping someone not lose face or so it is about, in some degree, about emotional regulation. And so that's been very interesting for me to understand in a very different culture, that there was very much, some interesting similarities in how people dealt with emotion, what was sort of appropriate or not appropriate. So then, I love Italy. I love Italy because, because all the emotions are out there. And you can see how I wave my hands all the time. So that those have been different elements of my sort of emotional journey and learning about empathy, getting to be where I am.
So fascinating. Thank you for sharing. That is such an amazing life experience, and to be able to view the world and literally the world in those different cultures, through the eyes of empathy. You know what I mean? That having that social awareness of like what are the social cultures, and for me, I think one of the powerful connections between empathy and emotional intelligence is that I think it takes emotional intelligence and empathy to be a better human being, just to, to love our neighbor. What does it look like to love our neighbor in today's world, which
Mm,
I feel is hurting in so many different ways? How can we be better neighbors for, what, and again, whether that's another country, whether that's our physical neighbor,
sure.
right? So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. What
I
is
do want
Go
I
ahead.
do want to make it clear that I haven't been as thoughtful and aware of all of this since I was really young. That absolutely not. I, crashed crashed through things, but with more understanding and with some, failed relationships, that has, and having kids. Wow, do you learn a lot about empathy and emotional intelligence? When we're talking about sort of motivating people and managing people and being empathetic, kids really is having kids and having to raise them and working out that, just telling somebody, a little person, what to do is not going to do it. I mean, you have to work out how to motivate them, or particularly even when they can't understand everything that you're saying. So that has been being a parent has been the ultimate, I think, experience and learning for that.
Yes, such a great point. There's a book I'm reading, and one of the big questions that they base a lot of their counseling and coaching and insights from is this one question: do you remember receiving comfort as a child? And it,
Hmm.
it's a really fascinating question, and they have, based on all their research and stuff, the consequences or benefits. So consequences of not receiving comfort as a child
Right.
and benefits of receiving comfort as a child. And so, like, we've got a daughter right now she's about to be 15 here in a couple weeks. And
Ooh.
yeah, yes,
that's
yes,
that's a tough age.
yes, yes. Oh, thank you for that. That's exactly right. And by God's grace, I have been on this EQ journey. Otherwise, I would be paying for my whole family's therapy because because it is taking a truckload of empathy for me
Oh yeah.
to connect with my 15-year-old daughter. And I don't always get it right. I share my podcast. In fact, literally within the last couple months, some big failures of how I've been triggered by some of,
Sure.
and it's of course it's not her fault that I've been triggered. That's
Mhm.
based on my childhood and stuff.
Right.
And
Right.
thankfully I have been able to work through that. And now, and literally I emotionally ghosted my daughter Sophie for a week, because I if I had dealt with it in that week, I know I would have lost it, because I still hadn't worked through fully that trigger yet. And so, but now, again, thankfully, I've been working through this. Now, I'm able to respond and not react
Right.
almost immediately. Maybe it's a couple minutes. It takes me a couple minutes to kind of, okay, all right, let me process this.
Count
Right,
2, 3,
right.
4. But also because she knows you're on this journey, that
Yeah.
she also gives you the time to ghost her, like to deliberately ghost her, because she knows that's probably better for the whole situation for you to take that time and process it. Yeah, no, it's a, it takes, everything takes two, but that's thank you for sharing that, because yeah, it's tough.
Yes, so it is. It is. At least it has been for me.
Right.
How do you develop empathy?
So I think paying attention, really, it starts with you. I mean, in my book, I have a chapter which is, empathy, it's about you. Or it starts with you, but it's all about them. So without any self-awareness, you can't have any real understanding of other people, because there's no context. So I really think that paying attention sounds simple. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. But for example, let's just say thinking about how you work best and when you find your flow, or when you get triggered. there's some of that stuff which is also to do with DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is like, is this emotion I'm feeling right now proportionate to what actually happened? And if it's not, I should be paying attention to this, and maybe if this is not going to be productive in this conversation, I may have been triggered by something. I should probably try and work out what that is, note it down, what was said, and just paying attention to all these different things. How am I at my best? When am I at my worst? I get really stressed. I travel a lot, but I get really stressed. And I even tell my kids, like, that I get really stressed when I'm, in those last few hours and trying to pack up. So please be nice to me. Or just like recognize I haven't yet managed to bring those stress levels down and that tension that I feel and the difference in how I react. But at least I know that I do it. So I've got to like deconstruct that a little bit better. And I typically, yes, I should plan and I should, pack way in advance, but that doesn't happen yet.
Yes. Well, and that's great. That's great awareness that, hey, look, this is leading up to me traveling. I get stressed out. So please either be nice to me or give me space or both, whatever
Right.
that combination looks like. So the paying attention, that's excellent.
And then because then once you understand more about yourself and that pay attention to yourself, it's also, then you can pay much more attention to other people. And because you recognize your own tension, you recognize more about your elevated emotional levels, and then you can see that in other people. And the other piece of empathy, just to be clear, is there's the putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and understanding how they see the world. It's not that golden rule, like, do as put yourself in their shoes and how would you act? It's put yourself in their shoes and how would they act? And that's a big difference. So it's really trying to understand the other person's perspective. So when you recognize your own emotion and reaction and your perspective, it's then a question of kind of like putting that to the side and say, okay, now how do they see the world? And how do they think about this? Because one, that putting things aside also helps not be judgmental and be able to empathize, because to be able to empathize, you cannot be making assumptions and making judgments and letting that affect it. We all make judgments and assumptions, and that's fine and sometimes very, very useful. But we also need not to have that impact how we're understanding the other person, because it was going to color how we interpret what they say or, react to or, interact with them if we're making judgments which aren't appropriate, or we don't understand the full story. We haven't really understood how they see the world. So it's a lot about sort of, some details and decoding and being a bit of a detective about ourselves and the other person.
Awesome. That's great. What is the relationship between empathy and our ego?
I think I don't know enough about this, so I will say that straight off. I think we all have an ego. The question, how big is it? And does it get in the way? So I, talk about leadership. In my first book, there's a chapter which has said leadership moving from ego to empathy. And I talk about the fact that leadership has been about the ego of the leader, and now it's more about the ego of the company. So the question is like, what ego, how big is the ego, and whose is it, and who does it encompass? So, whilst if my ego gets in the way of us interacting, again, it goes to that balance, is what role is my ego playing in this conversation and in this relationship? And if my ego is taking over the relationship, I would probably say that I'm not able to be empathetic because I'm letting my ego get in the way. And I also have to because I need to give space to your ego too, right? Your ego is your identity, and I need to understand that.
That's great. What is the relationship between our biases and empathy?
So I think our biases are to do with these judgments and assumptions that we make. And sometimes, yes, we certainly don't know what our biases are. And that becomes a huge problem if we're not aware, because that's why I sort of say, if we can understand what our judgments are, what our reactions are, then we can put them aside for the moment so that we can focus on the other person, because empathizing is about the other person. So if we have biases, it's really important to try and understand what they are. We all have them based on our context, our background, our history. And, lots of this, fine, no worries. as long as it doesn't affect the other person or it doesn't negatively impact the interaction. So we can't avoid that we have biases. One little bias that I have as a British person, even though I've been here for a long time, is I automatically support the underdog. Any situation, I will support the underdog. That's a thing. It's a sort of cultural trait, I guess, as well as a bias. Very different here. It's not bad. It's not good. It just sort of is. But I have to going into a situation, I know that my automatic reaction is to go to be supporting that person, which may not be in a particular situation. It may not be appropriate for who I'm trying to be supportive of or whatever. So just trying to be aware of what we bring to the table and all those different elements. And so that we can make sure that we are not making somebody else uncomfortable, or that the more that we can know who we are, the more that we can actually recognize and understand and appreciate everything that everybody else is as well. And this is the whole thing about bring your whole self to work. Well, we haven't been, and we're not really ready yet for that, but we need to be.
Wow, that's great. So much of what you're saying, what I am getting is it sounds like it takes a tremendous amount of self-awareness and self-understanding in order to begin understanding other people is what it is, or no?
Look, I've been on this journey for a long time, and I've also, I'm twice divorced, so I have more, and I've been living in lots of different countries. So I've had many different milestone events that have helped me be more reflective, be more thoughtful about it. And so maybe I'm, more advanced in some of these awareness of details than other people are, but I'm still on the journey. Everybody can start somewhere. Everybody can, the more we understand, we just move a little bit along that continuum from one side, further on to sort of understanding more about the other person. And you don't have to be always connecting with the emotions of the other person or really understanding everything. It's hard. So it's a question of trying. And the more that you can show that you're trying, if I sort of say, well, no, but what did you mean by that? Because what I heard was, or what I think you meant was, is that correct? Just me doing that, just me vocalizing the fact that I'm trying to understand you is what you appreciate. Because you're kind of like, okay, she doesn't quite get me, whatever, but she's trying. So let me try and explain it to you. And you also then learn more about the language and the interpretation that I use and what I'm hearing. A huge epiphany for me was I was at a conference, and a boomer, actually the sort of creator of the conference, was talking to a millennial in the audience. And he said, okay, hang on a second. There was sort of a conversation dialogue going back and forth. And he suddenly said, okay, stop. I just want you to say, would you say the first thing that comes into your head when I say this next phrase? And the millennial guy's young man says, yeah, sure. And he says, lifelong employment. And the young man says, of course I'll be working all my life. And I was like, oh my God, that's so different to what I thought. So the context of the boomer who said it, I also grew up at a time where I'm a Gen X, but I also grew up at a time when lifelong employment meant, a job at one company that your whole life. That's what it meant. Job security, maybe boring, whatever it might be. But there are lots of different elements and ideas and contexts that come with that phrase for me and for that guy. For the young man, and I've actually got almost exactly the same reaction when I said to another millennial that same phrase. So how people react, we can't assume that we know how our words are landing and what the other person means, which is why now when we're working at a faster pace, where we're working across generations, we're working across disciplines, we need to check that we actually understand each other, because even though we're using specific words, we may be careful with our words. the other person may be very easily having very different interpretations just based on their experiences.
Wow, that is such a powerful example. Such a powerful example. And and I love also what you said, that just making the attempt, just showing some intellectual or relational curiosity
Yeah.
can demonstrate empathy. Because I've got some number of executives that I'm working with, some big leaders, and some of them are super type A, very driven. And I've got an EQ assessment, scientific psychometric assessment that
Right.
assesses empathy as one of the emotional intelligence principles. And and I've got, actually, let's see, I've got 3 or 4 that I'm working with right now, senior executives that have absolutely scored little to no empathy. And the response that
Which is how leaders have been in the past, and that's worked until, well, it hasn't really worked that well in some cases, but it's, we need to move on. But yes, but I mean, so they got there without having to be empathetic, and so yeah.
and in true unempathetic fashion, they responded when I showed them the results. They said, "Yeah, so I've got no empathy," and right, like
Right, because it got them where they were. Like, I have become this leader. So a really interesting result, a really interesting story was at a conference. I was speaking about empathy and leadership to a bunch of investors, mostly investors. And at the end, this guy comes up to me and he said, "Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Empathy for leadership, all the rest of it." And he said, "Because when I was a Marine for 6 years," and I was like, okay, this is not going where I thought it was going. He said, "When I was a Marine, our squadron leader, if he hadn't really been empathetic and understood what we are capable of, what we're going through, how we're reacting in extreme situations, we could never be successful." And I just gave myself goosebumps telling that story. It's so meaningful to hear that, because it was the last moment that I thought about in terms of when, empathy is needed in leadership. I thought, the military was, or, the archetypal kind of like, top down command and control, but really in the field, it is that squadron all working together. And it was not particularly funny, but I used to have this picture. I've had this picture pre-pandemic of people in the military, and I share this story because I think it's impactful. But I sort of said, we don't deal with these kind of extreme conditions. Then the pandemic hits, and I'm kind of like, well, now look how much empathy we need now. And that hasn't changed, in fact, since the pandemic. The conditions are less extreme, but what we're still going through, the lingering issues that people have, or the moments that they take time out because of still dealing with trauma, or the anxiety of dealing with so much change and all the rest of it, we still need to be, caring and making these points, as well as the fact that we're dealing with very different type of working environment, very much faster pace, challenging business environment. We're having to work much more closely together. And when we work closely together in ways that we never had to before, but, pre-pandemic, we were already working much more in teams, working projects, working much more non-routine work. And so we need to connect more. We need to be more aware of each other if we're going to be able to work together effectively and not be in conflict all the time.
100% agree. And so a principle that I tell all the leaders that I work with is, if we just got better at validating and affirming
Huge.
the other person's emotional state at that given moment. And again, I'm not a big brain psychologist or psychotherapist or whatever, but I would, in my little perspective, I would argue that 90% of our conflict and tension and drama and stress and anxiety would drop if we could just do that skill, validate and affirm the other person's emotional state.
Yeah. And value their perspective and their opinion. Don't have to agree, just valuing them as a person. It's not, it's both the emotional state, but just who they are and the fact that they've said something. And I do truly empathize with leaders now who have had 20, 30, or more years leading in a particular way, because that's not going to cut it now, which is obviously why you are, you have, great business, because leadership is changing so much, and they can't possibly have all the answers. They do need to be bringing in and creating safe spaces so people speak up and tell them some of the things they don't want to hear, or what the ideas that they don't have, and then they actually have to be able to take it on board and really integrate it, which is why I find this a fascinating time that we're living and working in. But it's also a huge amount of change, particularly for leaders who are trying to navigate and not be in control anymore, because control is one of those words we have to kind of it's more about distributed control, distributed authority. All of these things are sound good, but they're really hard to make happen, make effective, and be successful in. And I guess, the one silver lining, because so much digital transformation, there's technology that has been driving so much of these changes, is that prior to the pandemic, a lot of 70% of digital transformation projects or whatever it was failed. Well, it's very, very hard if you don't have everybody on board, and everybody's like worried, well, if another company isn't going through this, what do we do? Everybody's in the same boat now. We're all going through this very messy period, so we can all make some mistakes here, there, and everywhere, and that's what we're going to do. So at least that is, one benefit, I suppose, in terms of us all being in this, going through this transformational period together. But it's hard. I mean, for leaders now, it's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And the other tough thing that I'm realizing for leaders, many leaders that have gotten to their position in their organization, in some cases without empathy, it takes, as you have been stating over and over and over again, it takes self-reflection, it takes understanding, it takes, and there are some, because this is another thing that has been lacking in many leaders, is a lack of self-awareness, right? And so when you don't have that self-awareness, those tools, it's tough to pass along some of that.
Very much. And I think there are a lot of things that, again, I think there are a lot of things that we can learn from the pandemic period, because when we didn't have, there was a flexibility. There was, a lot of it was informal prior to 2019, but I've been in this space since 2011. So, and I focused first of all on workplace flexibility. That was my big thing. So it's been around, but if you don't have any choices about how and where and when you work, you don't think about what with the optimal. Over the course of the last, 11 years, I have asked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, if you could design the perfect job, what would it look like? And unless somebody's an entrepreneur or a freelancer or, independent consultant, when they've actually had to work it out, like, how do I work best? Because otherwise they won't have a career. Then they give them this blank look. They kind of like, first of all, they look excited, like, ooh, and then they realize they have absolutely no idea whatsoever. And whether that's somebody who actually had a career, maybe took time out and took time away from corporate work and was raising children and then trying to come back in again, like, how would they design it now? Because they have this moment to, or they're working, 50, 60, more hours a week, and they're like, I can't do this. I'm burned out. I need to try and, I was like, okay, so now, what is it that you want? So that's actually a huge part of the Great Resignation. People actually kind of had time to reflect and trying to kind of like, oh, what do I want my life to look like? Because I can set it up differently. So with this reflection, when we were captured at the office, now we're captured, the knowledge workers who could work from home were, sent home, but they had time to reflect, to kind of go, how would I actually like, because this one didn't work, that one didn't work. Now what would work? And what are the different combinations of it? So this has been an important period of reflection, and for leaders too. So trying to look at things very differently, allocate skills differently, allocate people differently, thinking about a different business model. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting reflection about one's, the business, about oneself as well. I mean, there are lots of people, there were leaders who had no place to work at home. There were people who were, incredibly overcrowded or isolated, or, lots of different situations which challenged everybody at every level. And that, I think, has been helpful for leaders at every level of organizations to understand more about themselves and also have windows into other people's lives, and to really recognize them as, everybody as a three-dimensional person rather than sort of the two-dimensional cutouts some of us, a lot of us actually brought to the office.
Right. No, that's great. What do you want readers to learn from your new book? Can you tell us about your new book, and what do you want leaders to take away?
So the book really is about this new era of work. I could say the future of work, but it sort of came in 2020. So I term it as the new era of work, because that's where we are, very much technology driven. There have been societal changes, but so it's a sort of combination of all of those. But it's really about this human centric idea. It's effectively about emotional intelligence in the way you think about it, because I sort of use a broader sense of empathy in terms of how we're treating people, how we're interacting with people, how we're understanding each other in this new era of work. So it's really all about how this new dynamic, the new changes that we're dealing with, the new choices that we have about work, it's all about that. And what I sort of explain where we are, I explain how empathy works. And I sort of break it down, the sort of think, feel, and act, to make it, to make it sort of more understandable, to break it down into pieces. But then I have a lot of empathy habits, because to make it really accessible, and for all of those things, like asking open questions, trying to withhold judgments, lots of different practical things, whether it's to do with remote working and hybrid models, to do with teamwork, to do with leadership, lots of different bits and pieces in terms of how leaders can introduce some empathy habits. So it makes it really easy to sort of build it up bit by bit, because just asking those questions, that's going to get a better reaction from your team, and that builds on each other. When you're also showing how you're being empathetic, you get much more empathetic responses, and that leads to stronger relationships. So I do talk about empathy as a culture, as a sort of cultural value and a mindset and habits. And then there are many, many habits, so that people, and there are worksheets and stuff like that. So it really gets very practical, because, theory is all great and fine and sounds good, but I really, really want people to read this and be able to kind of go, how can I change the dynamic of at my company? And now we have this terrible standoff at so many companies. You have to come back to the workforce. You have to come back to work, which I find at times offensive. It's like, no, you weren't working, like, really? And why people have to come back to the office, and, so I think more empathy, more understanding, more thinking about other people is really going to help be more productive, have people enjoy their jobs, and not have to leave or resign or quietly quit, or whatever it is that they're doing or thinking about.
Well, that's awesome, and you had mentioned, I was just going to bring that up too. So the dynamics that are going on right now, the Great Resignation is the term, and then also the quietly quitting is the other big term. And if we and the other thing too is, as millennials and Gen Z, if they don't feel care, and really this is not even necessarily a generational thing. Well, it is definitely, there's some generational dynamics to it.
Mm-hmm.
But if they don't feel that their leadership cares about them, that there's no loyalty to a company like there used to be back in the days, right?
But there's no loyalty from the company. Let's be clear about that. This is the social contract. The social contract was the company gives me job security.
Right.
Pays me job security. And at the end, I have a pension. I have a pension, I can retire. There's no pension. There's no job security. So why
That's
should I
right.
work really hard now? If you don't care about me and you're not trying to upskill me and make sure that I actually have and continue to have value and competitive value, which is useful at the organization, or when I go and leave to somewhere else, which can be can be great for the organization because they're like, oh, well, we can't, develop you further now. So the loyalty now is not based because no company is trying to give job security. So if you're not going to give me job security, what's the new social contract that's going to work?
Right.
And that's what the core of that this
Right.
issue is.
That's right. Well, and it takes empathy to do that, right? And the number one the number one reason that people leave a job is not a lot of times, right? People, oh, I'm just not getting paid enough. No, it's management, it's people,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
and there's so many examples I think of poor leadership that don't have that empathy, that don't that have. And I watched some of your other videos that have transactional cultures, right, versus relational empathetic cultures.
And that's how we have been doing it. It is, so it's understandable, and we need to move on. I mean, so much has changed over the last 50 and 100 years. This is one aspect of it. And the great thing is that over the last 30 years, I mean, so much of the work on empathy and emotional intelligence has happened since 1990. It's very recent. Right. So now we have all this information, we know more, and now we can change how we behave based on good research. So let's do it. Because we need to. I mean, because we need to. And you do see the companies and the leaders and the executives and the managers at different levels of the organization and people on the front line. Frontline workers need to be engaged. The better they empathize with customers, the more sales they get. These are things that need to happen now. And as I said, you're seeing now companies that are doing it well. They're managing to hire people. They're getting lots of resumes in the door. They're managing to retain people. People are engaged. They're not quietly quitting at those organizations. They may still have people who move from one organization to another because that person, they can't, whatever it is that they particularly want to do is not available or not available anymore or whatever it might be. So, but those companies are sort of the sort of digital and emotionally intelligent winners. And we're going to see, and there are other companies which are not doing well on that basis, and they're not going to be able to hire and retain people. And in between, lots of companies need to sort of work out where they're going to be. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because there are lots and lots of things changing at the same time. And at the core of it, I believe very much it is human centric. There's all these changes are most of them are driven by technology, but that balance is who's operating the machines. It is us. And so if we're going to make this, be successful, we need to be understanding each other and be most effective in that. And the more that we can engage and enjoy what we're doing, the better results are. It's just, that's what the research shows, which is good.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. Super Sophie, this has been awesome.
And Ninja Noble.
Thank you so much. How do we follow you? How do we find you? How do we follow you?
Great. So my book, Empathy Works, it's available on, wherever you buy your books. There's the audiobook as well, an e-book. I actually read the audiobook, which was much more stressful than I thought actually doing that whole thing. But that's fun. So that's me. SophieWay.com, lots of information. I have 4 courses on LinkedIn, which are a lot to do with empathy for sales professionals. And I also have my podcast, Transforming Work. And I interview people with all kinds of different backgrounds that are all to do with how they're transforming work in different ways, to give real examples of what's working and what they went through to get there. The last couple have been about moving to remote first, and from the founder of the company, and then also the guy who's really sort of executing on a daily basis. So all of that should be useful. We're going through some tough times, and it's going to be interesting.
That's right. Thank you so much, Sophie. This has been awesome connecting with you, and hopefully we'll be able to stay in touch as well.
I definitely hope so, Noble. It's been a delight to be here. Thank you so much for having me.